Hey everybody, welcome back to Why Is This a Podcast? I am your host, Kerean Watts. Thank you for joining us. Good to see you all. I would say if I could see you, but I can't, so there. The COVID-19 pandemic continues, of course, as we continue to live through a Poundland version of the Book of Revelations. And as per usual, we will be discussing that at a fair bit of length with our guest who I'll introduce in a bit. But I do just want to talk briefly about the environment because I don't know if any of you have noticed, but the world's ending. We're seeing the far-reaching consequences of our environmental disaster in the flooding, which has ravaged Western Europe with more than 200 people dead at the time we're recording this. Many are missing. I hope that the rescue efforts will prevail in finding survivors, not bodies. But what did we expect? We've kind of been warned about this. Do you remember the Swedish schoolgirl who told us all the world's ending and people laughed at her? And now there's a heat wave. As I'm recording this, I'm literally melting. I feel like a Madame Tussauds waxwork at a crematorium. And you've got the heat wave in North America that killed hundreds. Flash floods this year everywhere from Afghanistan to Japan. Wildfires, droughts, hurricanes, cyclones, food scarcity, water scarcity, and even pandemics and infectious disease outbreaks can be linked to climate change and the degradation of our environment. We've seen so many climate disasters, it's like COVID-19, it's become our new normal. And that's sad. And 2021 is make or break, according to Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, at the launch of a report he described as frightening. Think about it this way, about how serious that is. He called this report frightening, and this is a man who has been in a room with Vladimir Putin. Guterres said, to avert the worst impacts of climate change, science tells us that we must limit global temperature rise to within 1.5 degrees of the pre-industrial baseline. That means reducing global greenhouse gas emissions by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030 and reaching net zero emissions by 2050. We are way off track. This is truly a pivotal year for humanity's future. We have no time to waste. We don't. At the moment, the message that climate change is sending us is, nice planet you've got there. It would be a shame if something happened to it. And by lack of action, we're sending that exact same message. I'm looking forward to discussing the pandemic, the environment, and more. Now with my guest, he's the managing partner, Global Health at Fin Partners, friend of the show. Please welcome back to the podcast, Mr. Gil Bashe. Hello, Gil.
It is a privilege to be with you and to know that I'm here. I think my third time on the program, and Kerean, I so enjoy being with you because you cut to the chase. Although I don't think it is all over and doom and gloom quite yet, but I think we have to take.
You could be a counterbalance.
Yes. Well, I don't want to be a counterbalance. I don't think that we can stay on the path we're currently on and be oblivious to what is happening around us, to the disasters that you have pointed to in your opening comments. I think we have to take note. I think that pockets of the world take note. Unfortunately, what we're dealing with is the diversity, the economic diversity of the world, and trying to get the world to align on the fact that what happens in Senegal does impact what happens in Sweden. What happens in Sweden does impact what happens in California. What happens in California does impact what happens in Singapore. And I think that comments, particularly by some people in the United States who said, how does the situation in Paris or the Paris Climate Accords impact Paris, Texas? I assure that person that the air that passes over Paris will reach Paris, Texas. If it's polluted air, it will remain polluted air. This nation, the world, will not be immune to the dangers or the perspiration that you now face. So we are really facing some serious areas. But I'm an optimist. I know you are at heart. And I think that we have to look at this from—
Who told you that?
I'm going to project that you're an optimist at heart. You'll have to just take it with a grain of salt. But I'm optimistic that the world does have the capacity to unite, especially now that it's endangered. It's endangered by COVID-19 and the Delta variant. It's endangered by the climate degradation that we're contributing to.
Speaking of that, speaking of COVID, we'll get back to the environment in a bit. But last time we spoke, I think, was December. And since then, how's the pandemic treated you since then? Have you been vaccinated fully?
I have been vaccinated. I was fortunate, even through the chaos of the US vaccination scene. And it was indeed chaotic at the earliest stages to secure a vaccine appointment. I was able to do that. Actually in February and March. January and February of 2021. So I was fortunate that I was among the earlier people who got vaccinated. Obviously, I've maintained both social distancing. I do in public places wear a mask. I do continue to use the preventive tools of mask, distance, and wash my hands. I think that that's wise. I think everybody actually, until we know much more, should do as much as they possibly can to be part of the global public health solution and not contribute to the problem. And it's also a question of setting an example. So fortunately, my family and I are well. We are feeling, though, the impact of social isolation, the thought of being in physical connectivity to people or with people in the same space does seem odd. It will take some getting used to. I do notice that the wildlife in my neighborhood, it's a suburban outside New York City neighborhood. I live near a nature preserve. At the earliest months of the nature preserve of the pandemic, I noticed animals I've not seen except in zoos, foxes, coyote. We've always had deer and possum, but these other animals were really new to the neighborhood. A black bear even wandered in somehow. That's unusual, and it really shows you how we have not been good neighbors to the animals that inhabit our region as well. It's all food for thought, because it's not just how quaint or how nice, it's how our footprint is becoming so expansive that we're pushing wildlife away into areas that may not be conducive to their well-being. So the pandemic and the environment actually are interlinked. We talk about the fact that the air over New York is clearer. Why? Fewer planes, fewer cars, less exhaust. We've talked about the fact that there has been sort of a little bit of respite for the environment during the pandemic. Now, considering most people were not on the road the first few months, now they're back on the road. You began with sort of key points about how do we reduce or we retain the heat of our planet by a certain degree level? How do we get to net carbon zero footprint? All of this is interrelated to this moment. If we can't figure it out now, I am concerned. I think we will figure it out, though. I think we will. However, I'd prefer we do it before the panic sets in.
Last time that we spoke, you had a brand new president-elect who has now become your president. How are you rating Biden? And do you miss
You know,
the
you,
last guy?
you asked my reaction the last time. Now, of course, President Biden has been in office for quite a few months. He's had to deal with some tremendous obstacles, the pandemic being one of them, the rebooting of our economy. He's also touched on some very critical points in terms of this economic incentive program that he's trying to work through our U.S. congressional system. You know, we have to look at how infrastructure impacts our well-being. We think it's about money. I like to focus on public health. I actually consider eco-health part of that larger umbrella. Obviously, there are experts who deal with the environment and sustainability, but eco-health is something I've touched on for close to 30 years. But what President Biden is seeking to do by trying to support the infrastructure plan is doing things that will actually improve people's lives. You know, I was vacationing, working actually from a remote location in Hunter, New York. And luckily the house I was staying in had Wi-Fi. But if I left that house, I lost all connectivity. So here we are, 2 hours outside of New York City, metropolis of the world. I don't have cellular. I don't have a cellular connection. I have Wi-Fi in the house, outside the house, nothing. We have to create in this nation, much like Europe has been able to enjoy, some form of a cellular or Wi-Fi existence that's not based upon how much money you have. So in Europe, of course, Wi-Fi is readily accessible. In the United States, it's not. It's not. So you have what I'll call the information haves and the information have-nots. Well, information isn't only for commerce. Information enables someone who has an illness to comfortably search the web for good medical advice, good medical background, where to go, what treatments to take, everything. So
we've discussed before the importance of e-health and telehealth.
Exactly. So President Biden is trying to deal with all of these issues. We're trying to provide childcare. We're trying to provide road infrastructure. We have roads that are crumbling here. So we have a rail system that could use clean energy. However, it is really not complete. So we have tremendous gaps in our infrastructure here. And those people who have the economics to live near places that offer that infrastructure have certain benefits afforded to them that those who aren't close to that, rural areas, don't. Now, in the rural areas, when you have poverty, you have right along to poverty, you have this troika of headache. You have despair, you have disease, and you have death. And so when we look at the infrastructure program that President Biden is trying to pass, we're looking to put in place vehicles that could, in fact, intercede on despair, disease, and death. So look, I think that a few things we can say, and I think both agree. One, we have less controversy in the media. We have a president who is not in the media every day, and you're not wondering what did the president say, and what should I be concerned about. We have a president who is collaborative and is seeking to work with Congress, Republicans and Democrats. He's seeking to work with world leaders. He's firm with President Putin and his counterparts in China. He is firm, but he does seek to work with them. He's not looking for aggressive behavior. He's looking for better understanding. So I would say to your question, how do I rank or rate President Biden? I think he's trying to bring America back into the world as a partner for positive change. And I think that for those in the UK, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, and certainly in the United States and South America, I think we should welcome that and encourage that sort of participatory behavior.
Could you say he's making America great again?
I wouldn't go in terms of the theme. Look, I wouldn't go there, but I would say he's making America part of the world again.
Do you miss the last guy?
No, I don't miss the last guy. I don't miss the last guy. I think that the last president, certainly as we can see from the polls and part of our congressional system, he certainly had created a very strong fan base. And I just want to bring up something back to health and party politics. I won't avoid party politics for a moment. Historically, America has always had very strong political divides. You have felt it more in the last 4 years than ever before, because your access, my access to information, this and all that that's feeding me news, we get it all the time. We didn't have Twitter or LinkedIn 2 presidents ago, when you think about it. Twitter, which I've had since 2009, was really at a nascent form. It wasn't a news driver. It's now almost my news feed. Pretty much. I scan the news on Twitter, and then I go to the articles themselves. So President Trump had the advantage of being, even more than President Obama, a president who fed on social media and understood how to exploit it to his best interests. I think President Biden uses it much more judiciously, and he's more balanced. But if we look historically way back at President Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was a president, obviously, of the 60s, who passed Medicare and Medicaid. When he was trying to get Medicare and Medicaid through the congressional system, he had a strong party majority. Medicare and Medicaid was passed almost, not quite, but almost along party lines, And the Republican Party at that time fought it tooth and nail, for the most part. The differences between then and now is, once it was passed in 1964-65 and became law, rather than seek for 4 years after President Nixon came into power as president, rather than seek to essentially tear it apart, they sought to enhance or improve it. Today, of course, even with President Trump, nobody would think of removing a basic benefit like Medicare from the American people. It is considered almost a right, like Social Security. Then, of course, they fought it. Subsequently, they sought to improve it. That's a big difference. Partisan politics no longer says the battle is decided. Now let me get my voice in there and add what I think is right. It's they did it, I don't like it, I won't accept it. And that's a shift in the American political think that I think is showing the divide of the nation, of the thinking process. Today, of course, most Americans, like Medicare, feel affordable care is a right. Now, how could you take away? How could we return to a world of pre-existing conditions? But keep in mind, for 4 years, there was a president in place who made it one of his key endeavors was to repeal affordable care. Thankfully, that didn't happen. The Supreme Court has reaffirmed it as law. So I think President Biden will be a president who will seek to enhance certain elements and improve and get that back on track. I do believe that accessible health is important to everybody's well-being, and yes, to reducing the cost of care, because we're treating people usually at their sickest moments. I think the next stage is not just to offer health care, which is really sick care. It is to change the pyramid, flip the pyramid on its head, and move to self-care, wellness, prevention, and yes, healthcare and sick care. But it's a continuum.
I want to mention variants, because you mentioned earlier about the emergence of the Delta variant. There's the variant which originated in South Africa.
Yes.
Brazil. How worried should we be about these variants?
Although I'm not an epidemiologist, in essence, I'm a public health communicator. We should be very worried about the variants for very specific reasons. We, unlike smallpox, it's hard to believe, in the 19th century, we already had a form of a vaccine against smallpox. And it was viewed as heresy if you didn't take advantage of that vaccine. Obviously, when I was a child, we had polio. And I remember with my parents lining up to get the sugar cube vaccine, and then subsequently the booster for polio. Parents who had grown up in the 30s and 40s were terrified of polio, and they made sure that their children were vaccinated as quickly as possible. They saw before their very eyes the terror of polio. They remembered vividly the imagery, the horrible, powerful imagery of the iron lung. They didn't want their children to face that vaccination. And then subsequently, we reached this sense of scientific skepticism, particularly around the COVID-19 vaccine. And that's become a danger to the world, because we don't realize, for those of us who are vaccinated, that if we don't get on top of the Delta variant quickly, it will morph into another variant. It's not just one thing. It's many things.
We've also got Delta Plus.
That's exactly it, and that's exactly what I'm referring to. So if we don't get on top of the Delta variant, if we have the Delta Plus variant, and we'll have another variant after the Delta Plus variant. It's really important that we make vaccination available, which is becoming more prevalent. And also, I was happy to see a major newscaster on Fox News yesterday, who has been on the sidelines, who is vaccinated, came out yesterday quite clear to respect the science and get vaccinated. I think people are starting to realize, wait a minute, 90% of the people who are now hospitalized for COVID are not vaccinated. And the vast majority of fatalities from COVID are among the unvaccinated. What's the solution? Get vaccinated. It's a danger. I do think we have to get vaccinated. And I think it's terrible that I think, and I could be wrong with the number, so I won't suggest the number. I will say millions of vaccinations or vaccines are nearing their expiration date in this country. And there are other nations, poorer nations or less developed nations, that are unable to access those vaccinations. We really need to look at this as a global problem. And that will get the world economy back on track, will get us back together. And oh yes, it will prevent the Delta plus variant from becoming a reality.
I want to come back to that, actually, to the vaccine access at the global level, because it's a major concern. In terms of, there are some countries where they've not administered a single shot. And I want to ask you this from a communications point of view, because it's obviously a political decision as well as a public health decision. And, you may have these loud voices who go, well, why should we vaccinate other countries before we vaccinated our own? Why should we be giving away our vaccines? What do you say to those people? And why is it important that we have this vaccine equity?
Yeah. So it's not unlike the environment that you kicked off the conversation, this podcast with. We're living in a world. If one piece of the world is at risk, be assured the world will be at risk. It's a tipping point, and it's a domino effect. We see the environment as a very slow movement of the dominoes. They seem to fall very slowly in slow motion when we come to the environment. Well, the same with COVID. It's not appropriate to talk about the fact that nation A is now secure, nation B is at risk, because what you find is viruses are clever. They need hosts desperately, and they will find a way to travel, if not through droplets, through air. And so what we're really dealing with is not COVID-19. We're actually dealing with what will be our global philosophy and mobilization around epidemics, around a viral disease. So if we don't actually act now as a world, we're actually setting the tone for what the world will look like on the next virus that we confront. This virus, the Delta Plus variant, is still droplets and proximity. That doesn't mean that the plus 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 will be the same root. The plus 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 could be more sophisticated. And so, yes, we've got to shut this one down. We've actually got to look at the mechanism of which we organize and improve upon it, because I think you'll agree, I think our listeners will agree, this is just the beginning. And so if we don't act smartly, globally, collectively, collaboratively at this moment, we're going to set ourselves up to start at the next round exactly where we left off now, which is not optimal.
I want to come back just before we move on to the environment in a bit more depth. About, you mentioned that it was considered heresy not to get the smallpox vaccine. You mentioned the sort of the spectre of the iron lung encouraging polio. This is what I don't get about vaccine hesitancy now, where you mentioned, for example, the iron lung. I imagine I'd have the same feeling looking at a ventilator. You know, how do we reach people who are vaccine hesitant?
So part of what I think we have to do is when we looked at the room with iron lungs and children and adults with their heads out, seeing the top of their torsos, with nurses attending to these people, those images were shared. Part of it is on one hand we want to respect people's privacy and their individual suffering, their families. On the other hand, science has become overly complex, where we're more emotive in our thinking. Scientists like to deal with the science. This is how it works. This is how it looks. It looks like a sticky ball. And we're explaining the science constantly, where I think if you look at it, we actually need to bring in more real life stories. And what we find is happening is we have to mobilize family physicians and nurses and families who are experiencing at the earliest stages what was COVID all about. COVID-19 is seen as a fallacy, as the governor of Florida has said, don't Fauci Florida. And so it's not just a political movement or a political perspective he's suggesting, it's imagery. It's imagery of big government. For instance, in this nation and many nations, we tend to want to avoid an authority figure telling us what to do. An authority figure, let me repeat that, an authority figure telling us what to do. But it's different when your pediatrician says your child is 12 and up, my children have the vaccine, and your children should have the vaccine. If you want your child to go to school, if you want them to go to summer camp, the vaccine, 12 and up, that's what it's indicated for. You should be vaccinated. So some of the challenges we face right now is perceptive challenge. When I was vaccinated for polio, I remember it vividly as a child. My parents were also vaccinated for polio. They were with me. So the family unit participated in the inoculation process, the immunization process together. Here, part of the challenge we're facing perceptually is, first it was this population, then that population, then this population. So we're seeing fragmentation of the system, fragmentation of participation, fragmentation of language. All of this adds up to essentially fragmentation of imperative. And so it's not enough for the President of the United States to urge people. I actually think that we know that Republicans have been vaccinated, Democrats have been vaccinated, Republicans have been resistant to make public statements of, I've been vaccinated. I think in this nation, around the world, it's a public duty for people of authoritative voice, not only to come forward and say, I've been vaccinated. I ask all of my constituents to join me in being vaccinated. That's setting yourself as a role model. but I also think media have to come into this and begin to tell stories. And I think we think in terms of stories. We don't think in terms of science. And scientists have to become much better storytellers. Storytellers about COVID and storytellers about the environment. The better we are as storytellers, the more we can get people, I think, to embrace and bring to their hearts those stories that have meaning for our lives.
Well, on to climate. Before I let you go in just a couple of moments. So you've been, as you mentioned, active in terms of eco-health for 30 years, I think you said. You've been writing quite extensively recently. I've recently read 2 great pieces by you. And you talk about the power of words in terms of the environment. What do you mean by that?
Well, we were just talking about that in a way, how we describe the dilemma we're currently in, both in terms of the simplicity and storytelling mode. But actually, if we look at connecting people who are concerned about a human factor like breast cancer, and you're involved in an organization, generally we refer to those people as breast cancer advocates. But when we look at people involved in the environment, for some reason we call them activists. That brings up a very different experience. An activist is someone I potentially want to avoid. An advocate is someone I want to sort of align to. So first of all, when we think of everything we're reading about the environment and people who are, as you were in the very beginning, warning us about the impending dangers, we say, oh my goodness, he's an activist, he's a radical, because we're not making the connection to the household issue. So the power of words means we actually have to start to sit down and look at how we relate to these problems. We're not relating them as you are, as immediate. I just want to acknowledge a few colleagues who really inspired me or influencing my thinking. And I've written many of these pieces actually in collaboration with them because they're so influential actually in where my thinking is going. One, Bob Martineau. Bob is really a national voice. He's really been responsible for bringing together states in the United States around environmental affairs issues. He's a great attorney. My colleague, John Bianchi, who wrote The Power of Words with me, John and I actually were very much co-authors about that piece. John is a master of words and linguistics and sensitivity around words. And there were other colleagues who I feel really share a point of view. Helen Shelton, who's dealing with diversity and inclusion. We forget who is often impacted the most by poor environment. It's actually often, tragically, people of color. Redlining is a priority issue around public health and the environment. Jay Metzen, who is really dealing with the sense of how do we measure these things? Amy Terpelik, who's creating social movements. So when I look at all these people, keep in mind my words or my writing, my perspective. I'm channeling your and colleagues we have in common, like Mark Chataway, everybody's point of view. I'm channeling out into the universe because I think we need to listen to words. I think we need more words on this that make common sense, and we have to actually mobilize 2 types of communicators. We have to bring together health and environment, eco-health. When you talked about the environment and you talk about the heat waves, you talk about flooding. Well, what does flooding create? In India, we'd say typhoid, right? Flooding, right? It creates cholera. It creates disease. It's not flooding in itself. It is a tipping point for other catastrophic illnesses. When we think of heat, we think of heart attacks and stroke and
mosquitoes as well.
And mosquitoes. So I look at this as connective. We have to stop looking at the environment separate from the health,
Oh,
air, water, soil. The next stage is our personal sustainability. And I'm not talking about because the planet's going to burn up. I'm going to talk about the fact that we're going to face respiratory disease, heart disease, cancer, other non-communicable diseases resulting from the environment. So yeah, the power of words is important. But I also have to say to you and our listeners, we have to do it in a way that invites people to listen. And I sometimes deal with the tipping point of where this is going, but we have to start with the fact that we really want to create an amazing world for ourselves and generations to come. And yet we can look at places of the world where that's not happening and say, how do we get on top of it in Los Angeles or in Shanghai before it's approaching the globe as a pandemic, epidemic, environmental catastrophe?
Been absolutely fascinating to talk to you. And I'll make sure that the link to the 2 articles I mentioned is in the description.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Of the video, because they are very much worth reading for anybody watching or listening to this. Very valuable insight from Gil and from Bob
Martineau and John Bianchi.
It's
a privilege to write with them.
Yeah, it was a privilege to read them. Thank you for sending them to me. So we've sort of been, well, you've been, during the interview, I've mainly just been sat here enthralled. You've been drawing parallels between the pandemic and the climate crisis. What lessons from the pandemic can we apply to the environmental crisis that we're facing going forward?
Well, first, I think we have to look at what didn't work, tragically. We're not through this pandemic. We're fearful about round 2 at this point. You mentioned the Delta Plus variant. So what I think we have to look at first and foremost is what worked and what didn't work. How do we mobilize more people to get onto the same page? We have to depoliticize public health issues. We have to recognize that more and more what happens in one part of the world impacts another. What's happening in India or Africa or Southeast Asia has direct impact on the developed world, on Europe and the United States, on South America, other developed nations around the world. So what I see is happening is what I've learned from the pandemic is we actually never really established sort of a partnership of authoritative voices that could work together and speak the power of words, speak in terms that people who are not scientists, who should be impacted by our messages, we have to really
relate to it.
Yeah, we have to get people to relate to it. And we're just struggling to do that now. I think we're getting there with COVID-19. We're getting there. But hey, we've been there now on the mask, distance, and wash your hands. The 3 W's: wear a mask, wash your hands, watch your distance. We just got there as we were getting into vaccines.
Sorry to interrupt. Because the messaging, I think, is a huge takeaway from the pandemic. Because in the UK, the government has been criticised, and rightly so, because their messaging has been so all over the place. So I think that's a very important point,
Absolutely.
At one point, the health secretary tried to convince people to, the former health secretary tried to convince people to abide by the rules simply by saying, don't kill your gran, which is blunt, attention grabbing, but it's not, I think it lacks the empathy that you need.
Yeah, look, the thing is, your gran wants to be in your company. Do whatever it takes to get us through and get back together with gran. The positive and the negative at times. But what you said has a message within your message that I thought was very important, Kerean, which is the science. People sometimes forget we know what we know when we know it, which is the COVID-19 experience was unfolding as we were living it. So on one hand, we said, look, we think it's this way. Then we said, no, it's actually this way. We think 2 doses is right. Then we said, maybe 1 dose is okay. The UK took that approach for a while. Let's give everybody 1 dose and then people 2 doses. Well, maybe it's not okay. Now we determined that 2 doses has to happen. So what we have to appreciate is expressing what we know and saying, look, this is a hypothesis, or this is what we believe at this time. We don't know it for certain, but based upon the trend we see, we're recommending do this and we'll update you. So what I've learned as a business person is transparency. Transparency leads to trust, and trust leads to inclusion, and inclusion leads to action. And I think what happens is that some people say, I don't want to say anything until I know the facts. The problem is, what happens if the facts are unfolding before our eyes? Nothingness, the void, actually creates a sense of confusion and distrust. And that's how we started with COVID, confusion and distrust. Go home. Don't see anyone. Wear a mask. Don't wear a mask. Just health professionals should wear masks. Everybody should wear masks. Wash everything. Don't wash everything. So what happened is we had many people, and this is the world of Twitter, right? We're living in this Twitterverse. Everybody is an expert. Everybody becomes an expert. Everybody has a social platform. If you've got X thousands of Twitter followers, you're an influencer. And the problem is every influencer is sharing their point of view. Often it's a cacophony of chaos. Everybody has a different point of view. Everybody wants their time in space or cyberspace. And therefore, who do you believe? Do you believe Fox News? Do you believe CNN, MSNBC? Do you believe the president, this president or that president? Do you believe the prime minister? Do you believe the secretary of health? Do you believe your family physician? I think for the environment or for the next pandemic, I hope that there are think tanks and people like yourself who are saying, and you know this so well, you're a leader in communications. When there's a crisis, there's a team that's appointed, and those people are the spokespeople, the defined, authoritative spokespeople around the crisis. When the building in South Miami collapsed, every day, twice a day, there was a press conference. Certain people are assigned to be the spokespeople at that press conference. And they say, if they don't know, I don't know that fact, Kerean, I'll check that and get back to you. We didn't have that in COVID. We don't have that in the environment. And I think as a result of that, with the learning that we should have on the environment from COVID is, let's get our act together. Let's collaborate. Let's tell people in language that they can, to your point, relate to what the situation is. Let's tell them how they could help on a household level, on a government level, on a national level, on a global level. Let's begin this on the household level and leverage up.
I'll take issue with one thing that you said, which is I wouldn't consider myself a leader in communications. I don't think I'm quite there yet, but I appreciate the compliment. But no, it's an incredibly important point, and I really hope that people watching this actually take to heart what you said, because it's very important. And yeah, it can't be understated. It's like I quoted Guterres at the beginning. It's make or break time. So we've got to be prepared now. Well, we should have been prepared for COVID. We weren't. We've had years to get our act together on climate, and for the most part, I don't think we have. So I do hope that I can prove an optimist. So
I think at heart you are, my friend, and I think that you used the word hope a few times.
Gil, Gil, come on, I've got a reputation to keep up.
I know you do, but hope is a superpower. Hope is what keeps us struggling to look for answers. And I think the fact that you use the word hope 4 times, I am hopeful, and I am a believer that hope leads to solutions, hope leads to possibilities, and I hope that everyone who's listening to your program continues to weigh in and look for alternatives to keep us healthy, well, alive.
I do too. Before you go, you mentioned the former president a few times. I find it difficult to even say his name. But President Trump, I've come up with 2 nicknames for him I wanted to run by you.
Please.
James may well edit this out, but who knows? The one is the sulking Satsuma, and that's the first. The second is the tantruming tangerine.
Both are very creative. I have to salute you. You always bring a smile and creativity to the conversation table. I think I would be hard pressed between the two. Both are so enlightening. But look, the reality is we have to look past that administration. It's history now. History will evaluate that administration.
But we do have to learn from it.
Yes, exactly. And I think that in this situation, all problems require collaboration to resolve. And I think that we have to lean into the moment and understand that we're at a collaborative time in history. And clearly, we are at a place where we see the devastation of what happens when we don't work together.
Amen to that. Thank you, Gil. Always lovely to see you. Thank you for being here.
I'm privileged. I feel like on the Saturday Night Live TV shows, when the guests come on and they say, "This is my 4th time, my 5th time here." I'm privileged to be, here my 3rd time with you in the program, and I hope we continue this conversation. Thank you.
I'd love to talk to you again. Gil Bashe, everybody, joining us from it's New Jersey, isn't it?
That's correct, right outside of New York City. New Jersey, the Garden State.
The Garden State of New Jersey. Well, from Why Is This a Podcast, I'm Kerean. Join us next time. We'll be talking to Reverend Mark Owen. We'll be discussing how the pandemic has affected Wales's churches. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.